Okay, so why don't we get going? Uh, Welcome everybody to the Center for Independent Futures informational webinar on able accounts and special needs trusts. I'm Dick Malone, the Executive Director of Center for Independent Futures. We're based in Evanston, Illinois, and we're a nonprofit committed to meeting the needs of individuals with disabilities so they can achieve independence and lead fulfilling lives. We collaborate closely with families using our person-centered approach to enhance independence through coaching, experiential learning, supported housing, and shared activities. We're delighted tonight that Mike Walther, the founder of Oak Wealth Advisors, will be joining us tonight. Mike and his staff helps families and loved ones with special needs access financial resources and support to live their lives to the fullest. For decades, they have educated and empowered families with special needs members by providing them with specific planning strategies that will improve their lives and the lives of the loved ones. Mike will leave time at the end for questions. So if you have any questions, please type them into the chat box. And remember that this will be recorded, and we may repeat that throughout so that people know if they join us a little bit late, that they'll be able to get a recorded version. It's an honor to have you here with us, Mike and Randy. So let me throw it to you to get underway.
Thank you, Dick. I'm delighted to get to share what we know and have learned from our clients over the last several decades of running Oak Wealth Advisors. I've got my colleague, Randy Gillespie, who's our Director of Special Needs Services with me tonight. She'll be filling many of the questions into the chat. And so if you've got a generic question, please ask that to the whole group so that Randy's response can be shared by all. If you have something more specific or more unique to your family, you can message her directly in the chat and she'll just specifically respond back to you. And I will take pauses throughout the presentation. So if there are some questions that are coming in that are related to the topic I just covered, we'll take those questions at that time. We'll then hold some additional questions for the end. And I'll try to be very respectful of the time limit tonight because as an individual with a brother on the autism spectrum, I've had 50 plus years of learning that time is the most valuable asset we all have. And that in a family with loved ones with special needs, we know that we all have to do more and do it in the same amount of time we have in a day. So I want to make the most of your time tonight. And so with that, I'm going to go ahead and pull up the slides and we'll get into the materials. All right, so by opening up with this slide, I think it's important to understand where I came from so you know the background of who you're hearing it from. This was me 50 plus years ago when I actually had hair. Now, it's difficult to know which one of us it is because both kids in the picture have hair. But when you're growing up with a younger brother who's on the autism spectrum, and he wasn't diagnosed until he's 32. We just knew that he had multiple learning disabilities and a number of developmental challenges as a child. But this was actually my 6th birthday picture. As you can see in the photo, both of us got Snoopies for the gift. Now, as you all well know, having loved ones in your own family with special needs, a birthday for one means a birthday for at least 2. And so even though that was my special gift, my brother got one too. And another clear emblem of the fact that we're a special needs family is that he's the one who's in focus, right? He's the one in the foreground of the photo. It's my 6th birthday picture, but he's up front. And that's totally fine. I love that about him. We still have a great relationship 50 years later. And he's actually the reason why Oak Wealth Advisors was started. It's to help families like yours and mine make the best possible financial decisions. And our firm really serves not dissimilarly from CIF. We want to be the guides to the families who want to engage us for their planning. You still have to be involved. You're still the decision maker, but we want to provide all the information you need to make the best possible decisions, then help you implement them. And hopefully with tonight's presentation, you'll have more information and more details to be able to make the best possible decisions for your family as it relates to specifically special needs trusts and ABLE accounts as 2 of the planning tools you should be considering for your family. So by way of background, you've already learned about my brother and me. Founded the firm in 2008 and really thrilled that last year we were recognized as a firm as a National Excellence in DEI Award winner from the National Association of Personal Financial Advisors. We brought to their attention that DEI really includes everyone, and that should include people with disabilities, which often get left to the side when there's a DEI discussion. So we're really pleased to be recognized for the work we're doing in this community. And then last year, I got a separate nomination and award through the Investment News. But more importantly is what we can learn tonight together. First thing we want to do, though, is apologize. We know when we do group presentations, we're going to probably offend everybody at some point with the language we use. Some people get turned off by the word disability. Some don't like special needs. I'll probably use both terms throughout the night, and I apologize for offending anyone with those. In addition, when we're meeting with families one-on-one, we want to know what your preference is and what kind of language you want to use around your loved one and their diagnosis. For some, they're proud of it and they want to use identity-first language. But in group settings like this, I'll typically turn to using person-first language and do it that way because it tends to offend fewer people. But again, individual preferences are important. We always want to recognize those and honor those when we meet with families individually. But tonight will be person-first language, and I'll probably use both the word disability and special needs. So I apologize in advance, and I appreciate your understanding with respect to that. I also want to mention that as we go through these planning steps tonight, I don't know your family's specific situation. So it's impossible for me to know if all the things we're talking about are going to be best for your family. It's really essential that after tonight and on an ongoing basis, you consult with your special needs attorney and your special needs financial advisor and make sure that the things you're learning are implemented in your family's plan if they're appropriate for your family, right? What's best for you is not best for everyone else in this call. As we know, knowing one person with a disability means you know one person with a disability. Everyone's unique, okay? So with that, we'll launch into the details. Before we jump into special needs trust and able accounts, though, we have to understand why we're doing those things. Why do we have to take those extra steps to create these additional accounts? Well, it's because of public benefits. As you're probably well aware, and you've probably attended other webinars that are very focused on this topic, public benefits are an amazing resource for our loved ones. We don't want to forget about those or lose access to them through our best efforts because we missed a detail. And as you're probably aware, in Illinois, and I'm believing most of the people on the call tonight have their loved one living in Illinois, you can receive services through the school system through the year in which they turn age 22. So through that school year end. So if they turn 22 in October, they'll get to stay in the public transition system through the end of that calendar, or through that school year rather, that'll end in May or June. Then after that, that's when these trust and able accounts become so important, because to get public benefits, as we're going to learn tonight, we really can't have much of anything in that person's name. Okay, so we want to make sure that when we stop getting those free services from the school, we go to the government and say, hey, our loved one needs some support, that we're properly structured with the rest of our planning to get access to those public benefits. Also, it's not easy to get these benefits. It seems like it's just a matter of applying and showing up for a meeting. But as we'll talk tonight in a little bit more detail, so many families get denied benefits for innocent reasons. We'd like to see your family not be included in that group. We want everyone to be successful and optimize their use of benefits by utilizing trust and able accounts effectively. Okay, so what are the ages of school supports? I mentioned in Illinois, you can stay in the school and get transition supports through the school year in which you turn age 22. On this chart, which is in your handouts, you'll see there's a plus by some of these states. That means you get the school year end during which the child turns that age. So a 22 plus means, like in Illinois or Indiana, you get to stay in school through that school year. Other states that are green, like Nevada, Maine, Massachusetts, etc., on your birthday when you turn 22, that's when you lose services. And that used to be the Illinois rule, as a matter of fact, prior to COVID. During the COVID transition coming back to school, one of the things the state of Illinois did was extend the time that people can get transition services through that school year. So that was one of the nice things that came out of COVID for Illinois families. And as you'll note, if you're really seeking those school supports for as long as possible, your best option is to move to Michigan. It's the only outlier state that goes out to age 26. So I don't know how you feel about it, Michigan, but you got to live there to get those benefits. Anywhere else, it's going to be 22 or less. This one slide can be an entire hour's presentation. You'll have it as a handout. I think it's a great reference guide. It's been our best effort to get as much information about public benefits onto one page as we could. Obviously, you want to keep up to date with all these laws and rules. They're consistently changing. So being smart about bookmarking pages on websites that you trust is a great way to stay current. But the key elements are that there are certain benefits that are what are means tested. So they're called means tested because you have to be poor and disabled to get them. And when our loved ones turn age 18, the government looks at them as being their own household. So even though they might still live with you, and they might live with you for decades more, at age 18, they're looked at as an individual. So if they're not earning any money, if they have no assets, they're technically poor. If you're working with CIF already, there's a good chance your child probably has a disability diagnosis. So they're probably going to be eligible for these means tested benefits. Those are an income benefit known as Supplemental Security Income, or SSI. That's up to $943 per month for the year of 2024. And then Medicaid, which includes not just the healthcare support, but also the Medicaid waiver services that come along with that. Separate applications, but typically you're doing all that at roughly the same time once someone turns age 18 or the month thereafter. Now, later on in life, if they've worked and they've earned credits from the Social Security system, or if they haven't worked and mom or dad are starting to receive Social Security benefits, they can step up to the blue level, which no longer requires them to be poor, but they can then get additional benefits through the Social Security Disability Income Program, either on their own work record or off of a parent's work record. And they can also get Medicare for health insurance. So there's the possibility that as we get older and reach retirement, our loved ones could be receiving both SSI and SSDI up to the maximum of whichever one's higher, but you might get 2 checks and get 2 layers of medical support through both Medicaid and Medicare. And Medicaid is what's going to cover long-term care. So we always advise families who are looking at that saying, well, you know what? I don't need any of the means tested benefits. Our child's SSDI number is bigger than the SSI number. I'm not going to worry about assets anymore. You know what? I don't really care about Medicaid either. We always have to remind them that Medicaid also provides those services, those waiver program services that can be invaluable. And you never know what your child's long-term needs are going to be. And if they need long-term care, that can be really expensive. Medicare doesn't cover that. So best to try to keep eligibility for those means tested benefits, even when we're able to get access to SSDI and Medicare. Randy, any quick questions on benefits before we dive into the trust and ABLE accounts tonight?
No, not yet.
All right. So what can we have? This is what we're going to try to watch for. So we don't want assets in our loved one's name to exceed what's on this page. They can have a house of any value, a car of any value, and then really $2,000 of other assets. If the individual has more than that, then they're going to be denied those means tested benefits until that gets corrected. And we typically see that happen is if they're receiving an SSI payment, it goes into a checking account and they get the next month's check and nobody's been spending it. Well, all of a sudden that account accumulates more than $2,000. And if on the last day of the month, that bank statement shows there's more than $2,000, Social Security is going to see it. And at some point when they recognize that, you'll start losing benefits until it gets corrected. There's typically a lag there, but there'll be a month or 2 of lost benefits. So our job as their support system is to make sure that we never get above $2,000 in an account that's in their name. Okay. How are we going to do that? Well, the key element to good special needs planning is the special needs trust. We're not attorneys, but we work with lots of them across the Chicagoland area, throughout Illinois, and around the country. We actually serve clients on 5 continents. So we've gotten to meet attorneys all over the country who specialize in this area. And we are strong believers that your trust should be drafted by someone who specializes in this area of law. It's not good enough that you love the person who did your real estate closing, happens to be an attorney who reviewed the documents, and he said he can pull a form off a shelf and help you for much less than that special needs attorney is going to charge. The reality is getting the trust right so that when Social Security reviews it, there are no issues and your child can immediately receive benefits. It's worth whatever that cost is to utilize a specialist in this area of law. The nice thing about a special needs trust is that no matter how much money your family is able to leave to your loved one, it's not going to jeopardize their access to those Medicaid waiver services and that monthly SSI or SSDI check. And that's because there's no limit on the size of a special needs trust. It can have an infinite amount of dollars and it's still going to be okay. It's there to support and add to what the government provides. Okay. The key element that makes a special needs trust a special needs trust is that all distributions come at the sole discretion of the trustee. And we often see language written by attorneys who aren't experts in this area is they put in there, well, if it's for the person's well-being, typically what's known as the HEMS provisions, the health, education, maintenance, and support, the typical provisions for distributions from a trust. If that language is in there, Social Security is probably going to say the trust doesn't qualify as a special needs trust. You're not going to get benefits until you fix your trust. So it needs to be solely at the trustee's discretion, hard stop. No other reason for distribution to happen. They have to make the decision. Okay. The trust itself is going to be what we call the beneficiary that we want to use for all their assets that are going to possibly flow to your kids. So if it's going to go to your child, let's say your child's name is John. Instead of John getting it outright, we want John's trust to be the beneficiary of things like insurance policies, retirement plans, etc. That's who the beneficiary should be, this trust. So that's why it's such an important piece of the planning. Without it, odds are we're going to lose benefits and possibly never get them back. So the special needs trust is the key piece. There are three primary kinds of special needs trusts. For most of our discussion tonight, and for most of your planning, your focus should be on what's called the third-party funded trust. Simply a trust that's funded by anybody's money, anybody's assets, other than the person himself or herself. So grandparents, relatives, random people doing generous acts. Anybody else but the person can fund this. And with that, it's a great thing because when the person passes away, the trust can distribute the assets out to other family members, to charities, to whomever the family chooses when they create the trust with the attorney. Why would that not be the case for all trusts? I'll get to that in a minute. But for a third-party funded trust, the family can pick who the future beneficiaries are after the loved one with a disability passes away. The rules are, like I stated before, for all special needs trusts. Distributions have to be for the benefit of the individual, and they're at the discretion of the trustee. That's going to be a consistent thing. And across all trusts, the assets are exempt from being counted as the individual's own assets. It's like it's a whole separate entity, not the person at all. That's how the government views these trusts. The other kind of trust that sometimes pops up is what we call a self-funded or a payback trust. Both words are used interchangeably. It's really simply understood as a trust funded by the person's own assets. Let's say the family hasn't been through a presentation like ours or anyone else's and didn't know any better. And then grandpa passes away and leaves $1 million to that grandchild who happens to have Down syndrome. Well, that young person might be getting government benefits and they're going to lose them because $1 million just landed there. Well, that's a wonderful gift. But we're going to give up a $600,000 or more valued asset in the form of SSI. And gosh knows how much the Medicaid benefits are worth. So we're going to probably lose benefits equivalent to that generous gift by not having it in a special needs trust. What do? You create that self-funded payback trust. It landed in the individual's name, but they can then put it into a trust with their own money at this point, and that works. But the caveat to that is the government says, we'll let you do that and get back to getting all those government supports. But the government gets reimbursed at death. Look at the last bullet point. When the individual passes away, instead of the family getting to pick who those beneficiaries are, the government is tracking how much those Medicaid services have been worth over the individual's lifetime. And so they'll submit a claim to the individual's estate and say, hey, before that trust asset, whatever's left in there, whatever money is in the trust at that person's passing, we get paid back first. If there are any nickels and dimes left, that's fine. You can distribute those to other family members, but the government gets paid back first. So that clawback applies only to the trust funded by the individual's own assets. So the goal of our planning, even though we can use both of these trusts, is to get the money to go to the third-party trust so there's no payback risk. And if we get in a situation where there's an oops, and gosh knows we have lots of oopses when we do planning and special needs, if that were to happen, we end up funding both trusts. Let's say maybe we get $500,000 in the third-party trust when everybody passes away and $100,000 in this self-funded trust. It's absolutely fine and actually a best practice to spend down the self-settled trust first before we spend a nickel out of that third-party trust. There's no rule that says you got to spend them based on when the assets were received. There's no pro rata rule. So we want to spin down this self-funded payback trust first. Okay, the other kind of trust that often can be helpful for families if they don't have significant assets, if there's no expectation that any relatives or anyone else in the family is going to leave more than, let's say, $50,000 to $100,000 in total between insurance, retirement plans, the value of a home, etc. If it's under that threshold, it's going to probably be very difficult to get professional trustee services, professional wealth management. So what a family can do in that situation is still benefit from the concept of a special needs trust. There's something called a pooled trust. So the person gets whatever assets they're going to get when everybody else passes away, and they then can move to a nonprofit. In Illinois, there's 3 or 4 options. Other states have several options each that manages a single pooled trust in the form of a special needs trust for the benefit of multiple beneficiaries. The way they do that is they have one trust. So everybody has to agree to that document. You have to basically apply and be a member of that pooled trust. And then accounting software is used to determine how much each individual beneficiary can distribute from that pool. So if you put in $50,000, you can take out over your lifetime $50,000 plus the growth on that money. So there's separate accounting for each person's portion of the bigger pool. And that allows even families with smaller asset bases to benefit and keep benefits for their loved ones. So with a pooled trust, works like the other ones. Your child stays on Medicaid, stays on SSI, keeps getting those monthly benefits, keeps getting those services through Medicaid, and has the additional support from whatever the family can provide. That's typically not one we're dealing with a lot when clients are hiring us, but we want to make sure everyone's aware of that, because no matter what your financial situation is, there is probably a special needs trust that can benefit your specific circumstances. Questions on the basics of these trusts, Randy, before we get into some of the details?
As long as we get into some of the details, there are a few questions. Yes.
Let's try the details and we'll get back to the questions.
Yep.
Here we go.
You got it.
So what is the trustee supposed to do? Oftentimes families will come and visit us and they tell us, oh, we've named our individual sibling to be the trustee. Okay, great. That's a cost-effective solution, but is it the best solution? Oftentimes it's not, because the trustee, first and foremost, needs to be communicating with the beneficiary, either directly or through a guardian or through some other family member who's entrusted to have that communication link between the trustee and the individual getting the benefits. They also have to be good at investment management, know how to keep fees down, and hopefully get returns up so that the trust can last as long as possible. They also have to know what appropriate distributions are. And when laws change, we'll actually talk about some that are changing this year and how those impact trust distributions. They've got to be on top of that. So they got to stay current with the laws. They also have to file a tax return for the trust every year and file any other state required paperwork in terms of documentation of how trust assets were spent down. So if they're not good administratively, that's not going to be a great choice. So you have to look at all those responsibilities in totality and figure out, is that relative the best choice? And one of the things, if you get down to kind of a 50-50 of, well, I could have the relative do it or I could hire a professional. Think about this. The benefit of having a sibling or another relative keep that family bond intact is incredibly valuable. And it's probably worth paying for an outside third party to be the trustee, because it's an awkward situation as the kids get older. If one sibling's got to tell their loved one with a disability, oh, you know what, you can't do that, or no, and it's no again, and no, you can't have it for that. Well, that's much worse than having that sibling say, you know what, let's check with the trustee. Oh, the trustee said you can't have it. Let's try to be creative and find another way to get whatever it is you're looking to try to acquire. That's a great way to keep the sibling relationship intact and still benefit from having the trust in place. So we tend to encourage families who can to choose someone other than a loved one to be the trustee. The trustee can have other roles in the process. There's something called a trust protector, which allows them to have a role of hiring and firing investment professionals and trustees and making sure there's someone who's attentive to the individual's needs. And that's a better role oftentimes to have that relative play. So what are appropriate distributions? This is what's changing this year. So technically, a special needs trust can really pay for anything, but certain distributions out of a trust cause what's called an in-kind support and maintenance deduction. This is true whether the trust pays for it or whether you as parents pay for things. And that list used to include clothing, food, and shelter. Well, years ago, they got rid of clothing. So if you want to buy your kids clothes, go crazy, buy them whatever you want. It's not going to impact how much money they get from SSI. As of April of 2024, that's why it's in caps, food just got taken off the list. So it used to be if the child was not paying for any of their own food, didn't have a program like SNAP, which is a supplemental nutrition assistance program, which might get them upwards of $200 worth of groceries a month. If that wasn't in place and the parents provided food, well, the child was eligible to lose up to 1/3 of their SSI benefit. That's the in-kind support and maintenance maximum deduction. So if the parents could prove they spent less on food than that, the deduction would be less, but there's going to be some reduction in benefits for providing food. That just went away. So it was your understanding you couldn't provide food directly without a penalty. That's changed as of right now. You can now buy as many groceries as you want for your loved one, and they can still get their full SSI benefit. In addition, the trust can pay for things that Medicaid is not paying for: optical and dental care, supplemental nursing care, and then things like travel, recreation, going to sporting events, etc. All fine. It can also pay to have a family member or other support person take a trip with the individual. If the individual support needs are such that they need 24/7 oversight, it actually is allowed to pay for 2 people, because no one person can stay up 24/7 to care for someone. So it allows for 2 support people, potentially 2 parents or a parent and a sibling, to go on a trip, and the trust can pay for that and not be a disqualifying distribution, triggering some form of ISM or reduction in benefits. So those are the kinds of things we can pay for with no problems. Let's take a look at what could cause some problems. So, and this is a temporary issue, but if the trust or the parents pay for basic housing expenses, things like rent, mortgage, utilities, if those are paid for, then the government's going to say, all right, part of that SSI monthly payment is supposed to pay for housing. We're going to take away 1/3 of that benefit if you pay for housing expenses, either out of the trust or the parents pay for them directly. So what's the solution there? One of the best practices is to actually have a simple rental agreement between the individual and whoever's providing the housing, typically a parent. It could be that the child's living somewhere and paying rent, but the trust is paying for it. In that case, we want to have the individual paying at least their portion of the rent they can pay. In Illinois, the law is at least 1/3 of the SSI check. So we're looking at something in the $330 range. And if it's more than that, that's fine. So a lot of times we're seeing attorneys assist families with simple rental contracts that say, the individual's going to pay $400 of rent. The neat thing that's occurred is that going forward, the law in Illinois, which is similar in 6 other states, there's 7 states that have Illinois' rule of if you at least pay 1/3, that 1/3 payment of your Social Security amount in rent, you lose nothing. So a $400 rent payment allows the child to receive the full $943 SSI benefit. In some states currently, you've got to pay the fair market value. So if your child's living in Los Angeles and the lowest rent you can find for a 1-bedroom is $1,200 a month, that's more than SSI. We're going to automatically have an ISM trigger because somebody's going to be paying the extra rent. So what they said is that's not fair. So as long as anybody pays at least 1/3 of their SSI amount in rent and documents it, as of September 30th of 2024, there'll be no ISM reduction for that individual. That comes into law basically October 1st. It goes into effect September 30th. So the first day of October, the law in Illinois will be the law of the land. So it's not often where Illinois is a leader, but in this case, the rest of the country is going to be following us with that provision. But if they don't pay at least that 1/3, we will have a reduction in benefits, which is why it's really important to have a basic rental contract in place. And if we have time later tonight, I can talk about how you avoid the parent's negative situation of, well, I just charge rent of $500 a month for 12 months. That's $6,000 of taxable income to me, the parent, in rental income. There are ways to make sure that ends up not being a taxable event for you. If we have time, we'll get to that. So again, trusts are the key cornerstone to the planning, but the documents alone are not going to do the job. There have been many times when families are coming to visit us and they'll walk in with this huge, impressive binder that their leading attorney prepared for them. Hundreds of pages, lots of estate documents, including that special needs trust. And like, oh, we did it all. Look, here's our book. And then Randy and I will stop and ask questions. Well, did you actually open accounts? Did you change beneficiary designations to indicate the trust is the beneficiary now, not the individual? Did you let people know that you have the power of attorney related to their bank relationship? So it's not enough to simply get the documents done. You have to implement them. And so that's a key element. And communicating what you did is also really important. And staying current, because it might be that the trust you drafted in 2010 when your child was born is not going to be the best possible trust today. Things like ABLE accounts weren't in existence in 2010. They are now, and they're an important part of planning. So making sure that you review your trust document. If it's been a decade or even 5 years, I would say, it's probably worthwhile to go have it reviewed by an attorney who's an expert to make sure there's nothing you're missing and there's nothing in the provisions of your trust that could ever limit your child's benefits under current law. Okay, so you want to coordinate. Like everything else in special needs planning, the family that puts their head in the sand is going to have the worst result. It's really important to communicate with people who are going to play a role and let them know what you've done with your planning. So if you don't tell grandparents that they should name the special needs trust for your child as the beneficiary and not that person directly, you're going to have that first party trust situation that's avoidable if you told them in advance to use the third party trust when they make their gift or put that into their own estate plan. So broad communication about utilizing that third party trust as the targeted beneficiary. Also, insurance and retirement plan beneficiary designations. Most times parents come in and see us and we ask the question, did you change your beneficiaries on those huge accounts that are going to flow to whoever the beneficiary is? Many people think that if they have a will and the will says, here's someone to divvy up my assets at my death, that's where everything is going to go. Well, the will control some things, but if you have an account with joint ownership, the joint owner gets the asset when you die. If you have an account with beneficiaries, all retirement accounts have beneficiaries, 403s, 401ks, 457s, IRAs of all different colors and shapes, all have beneficiaries. Life insurance policies have beneficiaries. For many families, the bulk of the assets they leave to the next generation are in those kinds of accounts. They're in insurance plans, they're in retirement plans. But if we don't change the beneficiaries to be correct, the will is going to have no impact. We have to have the beneficiaries correct. And the parents will tell us, oh yeah, I changed that. Well, sometimes they did and sometimes they meant to. And sometimes the companies they sent it to didn't get it done. It's really important to actually review what's on file with your insurance carrier, what's on file with your company retirement plan. What does your IRA account say the beneficiaries are? It's not enough to have sent in a document or clicked a button on a screen. You really need to verify what's in their records, because when you're dead, you can't refute what they have in their records. So it's very important to get that done correctly and confirm you have it right in advance. And the key thing there is really not to have any assets passing directly to the individual. We want it in the trust for their benefit and support. And I should also state that we've had situations where individuals continue to develop their skills. Their independence continues to grow. And the parents are then wondering, well, you know what? They're working. They don't really need these benefits anymore. They're going to be fine. They're getting healthcare from their employer. They've got their own retirement plan at work now. Do I really need money in a special needs trust? At the end of the day, a special needs trust, if it doesn't have to worry about making in-kind support and maintenance, reducing distributions because they're not getting those benefits, then it's just more like a normal trust, but it has that protection of distributions only at the discretion of the trustee. So it always provides that protection that if your loved one was to find a good friend who isn't a good friend and wants to take advantage of them, they can't get access to the assets because hopefully that trustee is going to do his or her job and protect the assets from someone doing something bad to your loved one. So that keeps the protection in place, even if you don't need it. keep government benefits. So we're really big proponents of using these trusts to protect our loved ones. Okay, and the last point on this slide, the usefulness of standalone trusts. Really an important concept to walk away from tonight. Even if you have a special needs trust in place, is it a standalone trust? So why are they better than a testamentary trust? Let me first define the difference. A standalone trust means that your trust document can be printed out on sheets of paper that are not part of a bigger trust. Literally, you can hand the Social Security office your special needs trust, and they don't see any other part of your estate plan. As opposed to a testamentary trust that's created as a subtrust or a portion of a parent's revocable living trust. It would typically read something to the effect of, upon my death, 1/3 of my assets go to the special needs trust for my son, and here are all the provisions around that trust. And here comes the trust language. Well, in that case, it's not a standalone trust. And as I just explained it, that trust doesn't even exist until I die. Because upon my death, it's a springing power, meaning that it doesn't exist until something happens. In this case, it's my death that causes it to happen. Until I die, there is no special needs trust. What if a grandparent dies first? What if Aunt Susie dies first? How do they leave money to a special needs trust if I haven't died? Doesn't exist. So by having a standalone trust, it eliminates the risk of someone other than the parent dying first wanting to leave assets to our loved one with a disability. Okay. It also provides privacy for the family. You could say, well, I don't really care. It's a sub-trust of mine, but it says in my documents that, upon the funding from any family member or upon my death. So it leaves more flexibility for when that trust gets funded. But then they get to see the rest of your document because the Social Security Department is going to say, all right, I understand the trust is part of a bigger trust. I need to see all those provisions and how this trust comes into being. So you lose privacy, right? And they also could inaccurately read the other trust document, the bigger one that this is a part of, and disqualify the individual because of something they read incorrectly. There are enough challenges getting your loved one benefits. The last thing you want to do is give the Social Security Administration more chances to find a reason to deny your loved one benefits. Okay, the statistics right now are around 1/3 to 38%. It varies from year to year of people who actually get benefits on their first application. So roughly 2/3 of all families get denied. We want to make sure that your trusts are not the reason why your loved one gets denied benefits. Okay, so let's look at how we're going to fund that trust. For many families, we're looking at retiring for 3. Mom's retirement, dad's retirement, and our loved one effectively retiring at age 22. That's a lot to try to provide for. And everybody's got different resources, but we've had very few families ever talk to us that no matter how much wealth they had, didn't see that as a challenge. So you're not alone. And so if you think you might need to utilize all of your retirement assets for you and your spouse's future, fine. Life insurance can be used as a tool to fund the trust. That way you can utilize all of your retirement assets and not worry about not leaving anything for your loved one. Life insurance upon your death can be the funding mechanism. And we don't sell life insurance, so it's not a plug for doing anything with us. But we want to make sure you do the right kind of life insurance purchasing. Most times life insurance is sold, it's not purchased. What I mean by that is you'll talk to someone who calls themselves a financial advisor. They're there to sell insurance and they want to find your weaknesses and sell based on fear. Your job is to go in there knowing what it is you want and finding the right product. The challenge we often find is that families hear the prices of different kinds of insurance products and opt for the least expensive one that gets them the dollar amount they want. Let's use an example. Let's say I wanted $1 million of life insurance coverage. And I'm told that this term policy, which is going to provide $1 million of benefit, is going to cost me $2,000 a year. Alternatively, this permanent insurance product, which could be either whole life or variable life or universal life, there's lots of varieties, but a permanent insurance product is going to cost me $12,000 a year. Well, I just mentioned that all of our families with loved ones with special needs have lots of different financial burdens and lots of challenges. So I'm going to probably opt for the cheaper one, right? The term policy. The problem with that is term life insurance is best used to cover lost wages. In most cases, those policies expire when the person hits age 70. It used to be 65. The policies have now gotten a little bit longer in age. Maybe you can get them out to 70 or maybe a little bit past that. We've had very few clients tell us, I'm willing to die at age 70 to make my special needs plan work. And that's the issue. You buy term insurance, and it's good until you're 70. So it's going to replace lost wages. If you die early, your family gets the benefit of having an insurance payout in lieu of you earning those extra years of income. But if you reach age 70, now you've got nothing to fund the special needs trust. So if we use a permanent insurance policy, while it costs more, we know then if we keep paying those premiums for however many years we're supposed to pay them according to the policy's rules, we will have a bucket of assets that will fund that special needs trust when we're gone. And one little trick to make that cost a little more bearable is, in most cases, if there's two loving parents who want to provide for that child, even if they're divorced, they're still supporting that child from two different directions. We know that it's really upon the second parent's death that the true financial need arises. And if you get what's called a second to die policy, not necessarily that you be married, just two lives. It could literally be a person and their sister, any two adult lives that are relatively close in age. Then the policy will be more cost effective, because instead of it paying off on just one person's death, it gets to wait until both people have passed away before the money funds the special needs trust. So it's one way with a second to die, or what's called survivorship life insurance policy, that we can get the cost down a little bit on using life insurance to fund the trust. So Randy, any questions on trust before we move into ABLE accounts?
Yes. Are there organizations or a pool of attorneys who are experienced in creating these types of trusts?
Great question. So we've worked with a number of wonderful attorneys. Rather than picking one or two tonight, I'll give you two resources that you can go to, which are organizations that are collectives of attorneys who specialize in this law. And there's at least 4 or 5 in the northern Chicago suburbs who are in both groups. Those are the Special Needs Alliance, and the Special Needs Alliance website is specialneedsalliance.org, O-R-G. The other one is the Special Needs Academy of Special Needs Planners. And the Academy of Special Needs Planners website is a little different. It's specialneedsanswers.com. And full disclosure, we were the first financial services firm admitted into the Academy of Special Needs Planners. I've learned a lot from those attorneys. They're great attorneys in both groups. So if you go to one of those two websites, search for Illinois, and in many cases, you can search by city and find someone who's close to you who's an expert in this area of law. It's probably the most effective way to find someone and my most objective way of helping you find them. Other questions?
Yes, I'm sorry, one's just coming. Yes, I'll put the names in the chat for you guys. And then another one, we were advised not to have funds in the special needs trust so that it would not be taxed at a higher level on earnings. For example, 38% tax. Can you talk about that?
Sure. I'll quickly address that and we'll get over to the ABLE accounts. I think it's important to understand that there are ways to manage assets in a trust like any other investment account to keep the taxes a little bit lower, but a trust is a separate tax-paying entity. So I appreciate that question. Think of the trust as being like another family member. It has to file a tax return like any family member does who has income. So once the trust is funded, even with a small amount of money, the trust is going to have to file a tax return. I may not even owe any tax. I've had arguments with accountants and attorneys like, oh, you don't need an ABLE account, just use a trust. Well, if it's going to be funded with $20,000 and maybe it earns $800 in a year, and with different exemptions and distributions, it won't pay any tax. The government still wants to see a tax return. So now you're paying an accountant $300 or $500 to draft a return every year on a relatively small amount of assets. And if the trust is bigger, the question asking person is correct, the tax rate on a trust is higher than it is for families. It goes to the highest marginal tax rate, which is 37%, at about $13,000 of income. Whereas for a married filing couple, that's upwards of $600,000 and $700,000 before you get to the highest marginal tax rate. So it hits the highest rate at a much faster rate than an individual does. So if you can keep the assets at mom and dad's level, excuse me, and have them own the accounts and own the assets until they pass away and then fund the trust, that is a better tax answer in general. Now, again, Not necessarily applicable to every single family, but if that's the case that you're in a lower tax bracket and the trust might get a bunch of assets prematurely, keep them in your own name. There's no reason to fund the trust immediately. There's no benefit to that. There's no distinct benefit to the individual of having it in a special needs trust versus mom and dad's accounts. But the taxation will start as soon as the trust has taxable income to report. Whether they have to pay tax or not, taxable income generates a requirement for a tax return. Okay. Let me go on to ABLE accounts. So ABLE accounts are relatively new. They got passed in legislation on December 31st of 2014. First ABLE account was opened in Ohio. And if you want to hear from one of the attorneys who actually created that account, you can go to Spotify and find the Oak Wealth Advisors podcast called The Special Needs Voice. And you can hear from Blaine Brockman, who's actually one of the people who created the very first ABLE account in the country back in 2016. Cool things about ABLE accounts. Super easy to open and manage. You don't have to see an attorney. In fact, an attorney can't open an ABLE account for you. You have to go online. And there are currently 46 different choices, and it's one per state. So there's 46 states that have them, 4 that don't, and you've got to utilize one of the ones that's available on a state website. That's how you go to open it. They're tax-free. So think of them as the equivalent of either a Roth IRA account or a college 529 savings plan. Those are the most similar types of accounts to an ABLE account. Assets go in with after-tax dollars, could go in from anybody contributing. So individual and relatives can both fund the account, but there will only be one. There are limits though. The annual contribution is limited every year by the annual gift exemption amount, which this year is $18,000. We expect with inflation that number will be higher next year. And an ABLE account, look at that last bullet point, has a similarity to a self-funded or payback trust in that if there's assets in the ABLE account, when the individual passes away and they receive Medicaid services, the Medicaid Services Office is entitled to repayment to the amount or the value of the services they provided if there's money in the ABLE account. So for some people, they're really worried that, well, our child might have a fragile health history. Maybe I don't want to have $50,000, $60,000 in an ABLE account. I have to give that money back to the government. They might want to use the ABLE account in a slightly different way. The neat thing we're going to learn tonight is this, the ABLE account can be thought of as kind of a Swiss Army knife for planning. There's lots of different ways to use it depending on your family and your individual's needs. So let's go through some of that. Well, maybe before we go to that, you will have available as a handout an Excel matrix that lays out all 46 plans. Because the question is, which one of the 46 do we pick? Well, in this matrix, you'll see that there are 46 plans. 18 of them are available to us in Illinois. So it's the Illinois plan plus 17 others that are available. You can pick among those that are available to non-residents, or you can go to Illinois. And there's the issue of the clawback. I just mentioned that under federal law, the government is able to request the value of the Medicaid services back from the balance in the ABLE account. Illinois is in a weird place right now, which is not an unusual thing to say in our state, as you know. There's lots of weird things about Illinois. The law says that the Illinois Medicaid offices can claw back those assets. Our current sitting treasurer has gone out publicly and said, we will not claw back those assets from an ABLE account when the individual dies. So the risk there lies that if we have a different treasurer in the future, that might not be the case because the written law says they can. So you should understand that when you make your decision, that unless the state's regulations say no clawback, there is going to be some risk at a minimum, if not a guarantee. There's going to be at least some risk that the assets remaining when the person dies could be taken back by the government. So that might cause you to think about how much money you want in your ABLE account, depending on how much you care about that potential loss of assets. Okay, so what are the basics? Go through this relatively quickly because I'm really more focused tonight on how you benefit from using the account, not all the rules and laws and regulations. But unlike a trust that can hold an infinite amount of assets, the ABLE account funding is limited to just $18,000 per year, plus the individual's earnings up to the poverty level if they're in fact working. So for this year, that's an additional $14,580. But there's other limits that will cause us to maybe not want to put all that money in at once. We'll get to those in a minute. So 18,000 is really the base limit from all their contributions, and then earnings up to another 14,580. As I mentioned, the money can come from anybody. And in fact, if you've got a college 529 savings plan for your loved one with a disability, and you don't expect them to use it for college or other higher education, it's okay. You can take the dollars in that college 529 plan and start moving them into the ABLE account up to the $18,000 a year amount. And the $18,000 is from all sources. It's not as if mom can put in 18,000 and dad can put in 18,000. It's per year in total. The next dollar after 18,000 has got to be refunded back to the person who put it in. Okay. There's also a limit, which is really irrelevant for almost all families, that the actual maximum account value size is tied to the state's College 529 plan. So they differ by state. The smallest one I think is about 350,000. The maximum is around 540,000. But for all of us tonight, we probably care more about Illinois. That is $450,000 for this year. So arguably, the ABLE account can be pretty large. But as we're going to see in a minute, if we go that large, we're going to lose benefits. So just because you can make it that big doesn't mean you should make it that big. So what are the other basics? One account per person. They could arguably have different special needs accounts, special needs trust accounts, but it's one ABLE account. And the disability must have been diagnosed by age 26. So for those of us who've got a loved one with a mental health challenge that keeps them from being able to work, but it wasn't diagnosed until they're 28, they can't use an ABLE account. We've got a loved one who served in our armed forces, came back from service with a disability, preventing them from working. Okay, they can't use an ABLE account, but look at the asterisk. The good news is that there's legislation pending that's going to push that out to age 46. That'll come into effect in 2026 if it doesn't get changed. Again, it's pending, it's out there, it goes into effect in a couple of years, but obviously anything can happen between now and 2026. But at that time, it goes to age 46, which should allow a lot more people who would like to benefit from an ABLE account to be able to access it. Okay, who can open it? Well, the individual themselves can open it. It's in their name, which is an important thing to remember throughout our discussion of ABLE accounts tonight. It's the person's own accessible account, even though the government won't count it for means testing purposes. So it doesn't count towards that $2,000 threshold, no matter how much is in there, up to $100,000. But they can access it. So you're at risk of having your loved one being exploited by friends. Might not be a great idea to have a lot of money in that account because that money can go out very quickly if they get exploited. Okay. You also don't have to be on SSI or SSDI to open an ABLE account. As long as you have a qualifying disability and medical documentation that that diagnosis occurred prior to age 26, you can open an ABLE account and begin funding it. Also, if the person who's working wants to fund beyond the $18,000 amount with their earnings, they can do so as long as they're not also participating in their company's retirement plan. They can't double dip. So they're benefiting from a company retirement plan. Their ABLE account cap is like everyone else's at 18,000. They cannot add earnings to that. That's one little differentiating factor. So quick summary of benefits. I'll hit on that $100,000 cap. So tax-free growth, easy to open, no cost, no attorney involved. Broadly defined distribution expenses. Unlike a trust, there's virtually nothing that you can pay for out of an ABLE account that's going to cause an in-kind support and maintenance deduction. We talked about how it's going to get easier going forward. Food's taken away, not an issue anymore. Housing's going to be easier with a basic rental agreement going forward at the end of this year. With an ABLE account, you can pay for food and housing right now. Not a problem. So think about that in your planning. Well, the trust can't pay for some things. The ABLE account can. Maybe it does make sense to have some money in the ABLE account to free up our distribution flexibility. A lot of people do it for that reason. Also, distributions are easy. Unlike going to a trustee and asking to have something paid for, you got checks and debit cards on ABLE accounts. So they can literally walk into a store with their debit card, tap it, make a purchase. And there's a document coming back because those debit cards are linked. So it shows what was paid for. So the government says, how is your ABLE account distributed? You can have a record to show them. As of right now, we've never been told by a family that they've had an audit. And technically, ABLE accounts are under the supervision of the IRS, not the Social Security Administration. So technically, it would require an IRS audit before you have to show up with your documents for how it was spent. So kind of a weird little difference there, but just to be aware that much easier to make distributions out of ABLE accounts. That can be good, that can be bad. It depends on your child's access to other people, what kinds of circle of friends they have around them. That's something for you to decide on an individual basis what makes the most sense. What it does do, it provides more independence. So for our loved ones who've got more abilities to be independent, more skills to manage money, it's a fantastic tool for that. So we want to make sure that those families utilize this to the fullest extent possible. Where are the limits? Well, we talked about the funding limit, $18,000 per year and a $14,000 580 addition from earnings. But the other big number to remember, if the ABLE account goes over $100,000 and our loved one's receiving means tested benefits, above $100,000, it starts to count as an available asset. So we make sure we keep the account balances well below 100 grand if we're receiving SSI. Talked about the age 26 limit. Also the investment options. You have to pick one of the 5 to 7 investment choices that each plan offers. You can't do something a la carte. You can't pick your own investments. You got to use one of those plan choices. And we talked about the payback as well, being similar to a self-settled trust. So were they similar? The assets are exempt up to 100 grand. Assets are protected from creditors like they are in a trust. They're going to be broadly distributable to the individual for their benefits. And there's that payback potential. Again, in Illinois, it's a little bit weird, but similar to that payback trust. I think we've hit on all that. I keep going here. I mentioned broad distribution ability. Fine, these are all qualified expenses. Virtually anything is able to be distributed from an ABLE account. The key thing there is it has to be for the person's benefit. The ABLE account can't pay for 12 people to go to the Cubs game. Okay, it can pay for the individual to go, possibly for a support person, but not for a large group. One last thing to hit on before we get to kind of the wrap up here, beneficiary designations. I mentioned it earlier. I want to make sure you go home tonight or stay home tonight as it may be, remembering this. It's going to be the most important thing for the majority of your assets, not your will, but what the beneficiaries are on retirement accounts, life insurance accounts, et cetera. It determines who gets what. We want the special needs trust named, not the ABLE account, where there's annual funding limits of $18,000. Bigger money goes into the trust. Okay. Make sure that if we've got individuals named instead of their trust, get it changed and get proof that whatever account that was on has that on their records at the company level. Also, keep communicating with broad family members. If you're going to name someone to be the trustee, make sure they want the role and they understand what that entails and have those skills to actually do the job effectively. Also, tell people there's a special needs trust in place for your loved one. Have them gift to the trust. Communication solves this. You know, we oftentimes share with families just some talking points for family gatherings, whether that's in the summer at a big event, maybe it's Thanksgiving when people get together. Whenever the family's going to connect, it's a good time to have a simple sidebar conversation. Hey, we just did a bunch of special needs planning. If you ever think about giving something to our son, please do it in the form of the special needs trust. It'll really avoid a lot of problems. And if you have that conversation, it makes things easier. All right, so I'll wrap it up with a couple of mistakes. We'll take any final questions. So hopefully this is all sinking in tonight. We want to make sure that we do not fail to send the assets directly to the trust. We don't want them going to the individual outright. That's a big mistake. It's avoidable if we know what we're doing. Second, purchasing term life insurance to fund the trust. We want to use some form of permanent insurance, not term life insurance. Term life insurance, again, only is going to be effective through age 70 or thereabouts, whereas permanent insurance will last no matter how long you live. And it'll be there to fund the trust. Then making sure we have a standalone trust document. We don't want it to only become available upon the death of a parent. We want it to be a standalone document available to be funded at any moment, because you never know when someone's going to want to do something generous for your loved one. Okay. Reviewing and updating beneficiaries. I've talked about that somewhat ad nauseum tonight. It's super important. It's one of the biggest mistake areas we see in the families we work with. Clean that up, review it, and make sure the firms have it in their records. and then communicate with all family members about what you're doing and why, and any roles you might see them playing in the future, and explain to them what the expectations are of that role if they're willing to accept it. Finally, not utilizing all the planning tools. I know you've listened to lots of other presentations. You've got a good group of friends around you at CIF. Make sure you utilize all the benefits you've got. Make sure you utilize access to programs. Make sure you're finding good information. And if you do all that, you're going to have the most success possible. So with that, I'll leave you with a quick look at the disclosures. It's in your handouts. Basically, nothing I said tonight should be construed to be specific advice for your family, but we do hope that all your families benefit from tonight's presentation. It can use at least something that we talked about to benefit your family and your loved one. So with that, I'll leave up our contact information and take any other questions Randy's received from you all during the night.
Yep, a couple of questions. Do you pay taxes on the money when you take it out of the ABLE account?
Good question. No, so the ABLE account I mentioned is like a Roth IRA or a College 529. In that, I didn't define this, and I appreciate the question. The money grows tax-free in the ABLE account, and upon distribution, assuming it's for the benefit of the individual, there's no tax on distribution. So it's really a tax-free account. The only time there would be a tax on that is if the individual, him or herself, has passed away. There's no Medicaid claim, or there's not much of a claim there, and there's still assets remaining. If the money in an ABLE account gets distributed to a non-disabled person, there is a tax on the gain, so the amount beyond the amount contributed. The gain amount would be taxed to the beneficiary who gets it at that point, but it's a pretty rare circumstance.
Can we recommend where to find an appropriate trustee, a professional trustee, if we don't use a relative?
It's a difficult question. I think it's best if you guys go to your specific financial advisor and or to the attorney you work with for creating your special needs plan. It's too difficult to say that this trustee is going to be great or that trustee is going to be great. What we do see is very few large trust companies want to work with special needs trusts. They're too complicated. The risks are too high of making an improper distribution, causing an ISM deduction. They don't want to get sued, and they see this as a higher risk area. As a result, when you find a trust company, they're often a little bit more expensive, or they're boutique, meaning that they're not huge firms you've heard of on a national basis. We work with several around the country that are smaller in size. Price-wise, you'd like to find either an all-in service where they're doing both the trust work and the investment management for 1.5% or less. Oftentimes, the trust companies we work with, if we're doing the investment management piece, those trust companies are charging around 0.5%. So in aggregate, we'd be less than that 1.5% total. That's what you should shoot for. We've seen cases for people paying over 3% for that service. That seems high. So be a competitive shopper. There's lots of options out there. And oftentimes a smaller firm that wants to do this work is a great place to go. But I would turn you back to the attorney you work with, your financial advisor, or if you want to contact us after tonight, we can give you a couple names that we've worked with successfully. But it's really going to be important to make sure it fits your family and your circumstances most appropriately.
Okay, a few more questions. For the additional ABLE contributions tied to wages, do these contributions have to be from the ABLE account owner, or can anyone make that extra contribution?
Good question. So in order for the contribution to come into the account above $18,000, it has to be designated as from earnings. So the first $18,000, there's no need to tell the ABLE account administrator where the money came from. They don't care. Above $18,000, you've got to have proof there's earnings. And much like cases where an individual might have earnings for the summer and the parent technically funds their IRA account when they're younger, we've seen that a lot with clients. That's fine. It's a gift, right? If someone other than the person themselves puts it in, but a parent could put that in for the child if they wanted to, up to the amount of the child's actual earnings. You'd simply designate as this is additional earnings contribution, but then the parent's got to make sure they track that as a gift the parent made to the child. This is really not the night for talking about gift tax planning, but that may or may not be a good idea if you're a family based on other gifting you might be doing.
If one is a plenary guardian, how does this affect the ABLE account setup?
Great question. So for those who don't know the term plenary guardian, in Illinois, when you have full guardianship, meaning you're in charge of everything for that child, that's a full guardianship, known as a plenary guardianship. In that case, the child can't enter into a contract, can't do any financial management themselves, literally can't make decisions for themselves legally. In that case, the guardian will be the one who opens the ABLE account. The guardian will be the one who's making those distributions out of the able account as if they were the person. You literally have the guardian take the place of the individual. So everything we talked about, the individual having the control, that control is in the hands of the guardian. It doesn't take away from a guardianship at all, because in a place of a guardianship like that, where it's a full guardianship, the guardian makes all the decisions, does all the transactions for the benefit of the individual. Hopefully that makes sense.
Thank you. I'm going to circle back to one special needs trust question, if that's okay. What about the risk of mom and dad's funds being used up for long-term nursing home care? Wouldn't it protect the funds for the disabled individual if funds are put into the special needs trust before the parent dies?
Sure. So if you were doing Medicaid planning, which is way beyond the scope of tonight, and you wanted to get the parents' assets down to zero so they can get Medicaid funded long-term care themselves, if that's the intent, then yes, the parents funded along the course of their lifetime money into the trust earlier, that can help the parents get their assets down to zero first. I don't know many people who are planning to actively spend out all their money during their lifetime and take the risk of what else they're not going to have available. Yes, it would allow them to get Medicaid services for long-term care, but they might want to take a trip. Medicaid's not paying for trips. So it's not a great planning technique to fund early just to try to get the parents eligible for Medicaid long-term care. But in certain circumstances, maybe that's what you have to do. And again, I would say that's a one-off circumstance to talk to your specific financial advisor about your circumstances. But in most cases, we would not advise people to pre-fund a special needs trust. And there's obviously the risk if you do that of actually running out of money even sooner than you thought.
Okay, it looks as though I might have one more question, and this is just a confirmation regarding SSI and SSDI.
Okay.
Confirming you said an individual with a disability can get SSI and SSDI simultaneously after a parent starts receiving SSDI. Is there a monthly maximum?
So there is a monthly maximum based on the individual and the connection to the parents. Without knowing your specific circumstances, I can't tell you what that number is. But in every case, there's a calculation the government's going to do based on either the person's own earnings, if that's their SSDI benefit, or off the parent's earnings, if that's where the benefit's coming from for SSDI purposes. Let's say in an example, the SSDI amount is going to be $1,500 a month, and SSI, as we know, is $943. The government would say, okay, your max is $1,500. We're going to have SSI pay up to $943, and then I got to do the math in my head now. The other $557, how'd I do, comes from SSDI. So literally both programs will pay to get to the $1,500 total. So you get two checks, two different agencies, but for the maximum of the two, the highest of the two. And again, the calculation of what that highest number is going to really be dependent on the person's own work record or the parent's work record, if that's where that number is coming from.
Okay, one more.
Sure.
I think I've got three more minutes. When transferring assets invested in another account into an ABLE, do you lose any long-term benefit or are there costs?
Wow, not quite sure I understand the question. So if my wife and I have investment accounts, we want to fund our child's special needs, fund our child's ABLE account. It's really an investment decision like you would for anything else. There are certain things you can pull out of your accounts tax-free if there's no gain, maybe you have a loss. You can generate the cash that way and then fund the ABLE account. But if you had something with a large capital gain, you bought NVIDIA stock 2 years ago and it's up 500%. There might be a big tax consequence to using a sale of NVIDIA stock to fund the cash to fund the ABLE account. But you must use cash to fund the ABLE account. You can't fund it with other assets. It's not like an investment account. It's an account that's driven by the state regulations, and you'll have 5 different or 7 different investment choices, which are basically everything from a money market savings account up to being all invested in stock funds, but you can't pick the stocks. It's really their stock selection, and you have to live with it. And there's different slices of that with some in bonds, some in stocks, some in cash, and different variations of risk throughout that spectrum of 7 different choices. Hopefully that answers the question.
It does. Thank you. Can you tell everybody how to avoid taxes on their rent payment?
Yes, thank you. I said I was going to. We almost got to 8:15. I haven't answered it. So let's assume we want to avoid the in-kind support and maintenance for housing. I think we all want to avoid that. So in Illinois, let's just use a round number of $400. So we're gonna have rent charged at $400 of a very simple rental contract. Mom and dad pick up $400 a month of rental income. That's $4,800 a year. That has to go on the tax return. We have to prove that we actually received rental income for that to be a legitimate contract. But mom and dad are thinking, I don't want to pay taxes on that. They might not have to, because think about it. If you're charging rent for a portion of your house, well, that person's living in a portion of your house. So you can apportion to them part of your mortgage, part of your real estate taxes, part of your utilities, right? They're living in part of the house, allocate the expenses. So at the end of the day, on your tax return, you show $4,800 of rental income, then you have rental expenses, a portion of all the things I just mentioned, mortgage payments, real estate taxes, utilities. And I would guess you could probably find more than $4,800 to allocate to that person. At the end of the day, then you got $4,800 of income, $6,000 of expenses, a net loss of $1,200. You don't get to take the loss, but you don't have any income either. So you have to report it, but you're probably not going to have to pay extra income taxes because you did it with proper planning. And so that's really the key there is keep good records. If it's a 3-bedroom house and they get one of the 3 bedrooms, arguably 1/3 of the overhead is a reasonable allocation. I would talk to your tax advisor specifically about your specific circumstances, but that'd be a reasonable approach to take in most cases. Any other chances for me to provide tax advice like our last slide said I would not do? Go ahead.
I think we're set. I just wanted to
Okay.
let everybody know that the last chat, I put in our email addresses. And if you have any questions or would like any follow-up or we didn't answer something, if you have something specific, please feel free to just reach out and let us know. We're happy to answer, just like
We greatly appreciate you spending your time with us tonight. Hopefully everybody comes away with learning 1 or 2 new things you can share with friends, and hopefully your planning is more effective for you and your loved ones. We really appreciate you spending the time with us tonight. And with that, we'll say good night. Take care,
Mike,
everyone.
thank you so much for sharing your expertise with us. We're really appreciative, and you're now empowering families. It's really commendable what you've done here tonight. We appreciate your time and valuable contribution. And just a reminder, we'll be sending all those who attended a link to the recording of tonight's presentation, along with slides and resource material that Mike has made available to us. So thanks again for joining us, and we'll see you next time.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you all. Good night.